Monica Ellis shifted uncomfortably in her first-class seat, rolling her shoulders in an attempt to ease the dull ache in her lower back. At 7 months pregnant, every position felt temporary, each slight movement bringing either a moment of relief or a fresh wave of discomfort. She exhaled softly, resting a protective hand on her belly. A gentle kick met her palm, and she smiled despite herself. The flight to Los Angeles was long, and though she had been careful about flying this late in her pregnancy, this trip was necessary. Her husband, Leonard Ellis, was waiting for her on the other side. That alone made the discomfort worth it. The first-class cabin was a cocoon of luxury, an oasis of space and quiet that contrasted sharply with the bustle of the economy section she had passed through earlier. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the subtle notes of expensive cologne from the businessmen seated around her. The sound of hushed conversations and the occasional clink of fine china filled the space, as flight attendants moved with effortless grace through the aisles, ensuring each passenger's needs were met. Yet, despite the elegance, Monica felt a tightness in her chest, a pressure she couldn't quite shake. She shifted again, trying to find a more comfortable position, but the pain in her back persisted. A second pillow would make all the difference. It was a small request, hardly an unreasonable one. She had traveled in first class before and knew that extra pillows were available. As a flight attendant passed by, Monica lifted her hand slightly, her voice soft but clear. "Excuse me," she said, offering a polite smile. "Could I have another pillow, please?" The woman in uniform, her name tag reading Claire Matheson, paused mid-step and turned. Monica noticed the sharpness in her eyes before she even spoke. There was a certain calculation there, a moment of assessment that Monica had seen before, though she wished she hadn't. Claire's lips pressed together, and when she finally spoke, her voice was clipped, devoid of the warmth she had used just moments ago with the older gentleman across the aisle. "You already have one." Monica blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the abruptness. "I know," she said, keeping her tone even, "but I'm pregnant, and my back is hurting. If there's an extra one, I'd really appreciate it." Claire sighed loudly, her exasperation deliberately loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "First-class amenities are limited. Ma'am, we can't just give out extra pillows because someone asks." The words weren't just dismissive, they were performative. They were meant to put Monica in her place. A few passengers turned their heads, their curiosity piqued by the sharpness of Claire's tone. But the moment Monica met their eyes, they quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't been listening. Monica felt a heat rise in her cheeks, not just from embarrassment, but from something deeper, something she had spent years learning how to swallow. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't need it," she said, keeping her voice calm. Claire exhaled sharply, shifting her weight onto one foot. "Look, I understand you're pregnant, but rules are rules. If I give you another pillow, I have to give everyone another pillow. That's not how this works." Monica clenched her fingers around the armrest, forcing herself to take a slow breath. She knew what was happening. She had seen it play out in different ways, in different spaces, with different people. It was never outright, never loud enough to be called out. It was always just enough, a little extra inconvenience, a little less courtesy, a little more doubt about whether or not she belonged. Before she could respond, another flight attendant, a younger woman with dark curls pinned into a bun, hesitated nearby. Her name tag read Lily. She shifted uneasily, then cleared her throat. "I think there might be some extra pillows in storage," Lily offered tentatively. Claire turned to her sharply, eyes narrowing. "And I think I know my job." "Lily." The younger woman pursed her lips and stepped back quickly, clearly unwilling to push the issue further. Monica inhaled deeply, forcing herself to suppress the frustration rising in her chest. She wasn't in the mood to argue, not here, not in front of a plane full of strangers who would pretend not to notice. Instead, she reached for her phone. "Monica, they won't give me a pillow. The flight attendant just humiliated me in front of everyone." She hit send. A few seconds later, her phone vibrated with a reply. "Leonard." "Who?" Her heartbeat picked up slightly as she glanced toward Claire, who had already moved on, chatting with another flight attendant as if nothing had happened. "Monica. I don't know her name, but she just made a big mistake." She placed her phone down and folded her hands over her belly, forcing herself to breathe deeply. She wasn't going to let Claire ruin her flight. She wasn't going to let the humiliation win. But she also knew her husband. Leonard Ellis wasn't the kind of man who let things like this slide. If he was asking for the flight number, it meant something was about to happen. Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, Claire poured herself a quick cup of coffee, muttering under her breath as she glanced toward first class. Lily, still visibly uncomfortable from the earlier exchange, hesitated before speaking. I think she really needed that pillow, she said carefully. She wasn't being unreasonable. Claire scoffed, taking a slow sip. Oh, please, you saw her. Some people just think they're more important than they are. Lily's stomach twisted. She wanted to say something else, but she knew better. Claire had been a senior flight attendant for years. She never admitted when she was wrong. Just then, the intercom crackled. Claire Matheson, please report to the cockpit immediately. Claire froze, her cup of coffee still in her hand. Passengers exchanged curious glances. Monica's lips curled into a slight smile. Here we go. Monica Ellis sat still in her first-class seat, fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. The tension in the cabin had shifted. The murmurs of passengers, the polite clinks of silverware against porcelain, and the rustling of newspapers, all of it felt quieter now. Heavier, like the air had thickened. She wasn't imagining it. People had noticed what had happened. The problem was, they had also chosen not to act. Monica glanced at the man sitting across the aisle, a distinguished-looking gentleman in a tailored navy suit. He had been watching the exchange earlier. When she met his gaze, he quickly lowered his eyes, pretending to be engrossed in his magazine. Coward. She had seen this too many times before. The silence of bystanders was almost worse than the act itself. She picked up her phone and glanced at the last message from her husband. Leonard. What's the flight number? She typed quickly. Monica. 378. New York to Los Angeles. She hit send. Then, she waited. Claire Matheson continued working the cabin, her movements brisk and unbothered. She had already dismissed Monica's presence in her mind. To her, this incident was over. She had shut down a difficult passenger and moved on. Monica exhaled slowly, running a hand over her belly. The baby kicked again, as if sensing the shift in energy. You feel it too, don't you? She murmured. The waiting was the hardest part. But Monica knew her husband. And if Leonard Ellis was asking for the flight number, that meant something was about to happen. Claire leaned against the counter in the galley, stirring sugar into her coffee. She's not special, you know, she muttered. Lily, the younger flight attendant, hesitated before responding. I think she was just uncomfortable. She's pregnant. Claire scoffed. So? I've seen pregnant women before. She was trying to pull the special treatment card. First class doesn't mean extra first class. Lily bit her lip, knowing better than to argue. But something about Claire's tone unsettled her. Then, the intercom crackled. Claire Matheson, please report to the cockpit immediately. Claire's grip on her cup tightened. A few passengers nearby turned their heads. The soft hum of conversation faltered for a moment before resuming. Lily glanced at her. That's unusual. Claire's jaw tensed. She placed her coffee down and straightened her uniform. Probably nothing, she said, smoothing her blouse with a quick swipe of her hands. I'll be back. She walked briskly toward the front of the plane, her heels clicking against the carpeted floor. As she reached the cockpit, Captain Reeves was seated at the controls, his hands resting calmly on the dashboard. He didn't look up right away. Instead, he stared at a small screen in front of him, where a live video call was active. Claire followed his gaze. On the screen, a man sat behind a massive oak desk, his dark eyes unreadable, his posture relaxed but authoritative. Leonard Ellis. Her stomach turned to ice. Leonard Ellis wasn't just a powerful businessman. He wasn't just wealthy. He owned one of the largest airline corporations in the country. This airline. She swallowed. Captain Reeves finally turned his head, looking at her with an expression that wasn't quite pity, but something close to it. Miss Matheson, he said, voice even, would you like to explain something to me? Claire squared her shoulders. Of course, Captain. What's the issue? Leonard leaned forward slightly on the screen, his voice smooth and controlled. The issue, Miss Matheson, is that we received a direct complaint from executive headquarters. A first-class passenger was mistreated on this flight. Would you care to elaborate? Claire's throat tightened. A complaint from executive headquarters? Mid-flight? She forced a neutral expression. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I was simply enforcing first-class policies." Leonard's face remained unreadable. "Did you check her ticket before deciding she didn't qualify for an extra pillow?" Silence. Claire's mind scrambled. She had already lost control of the conversation. She could feel it slipping through her fingers. I checked it. Yes, she lied. But I was ensuring fairness. If I make an exception for one passenger, others will expect the same treatment." Leonard's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, he dropped the bombshell. "The woman you refused a pillow is Monica Ellis." Claire's blood ran cold. Captain Reeves leaned back, watching her closely, waiting for the realization to fully sink in. Leonard didn't wait. His voice was clipped, direct. "Do you have any idea who her husband is?" The air felt thick, suffocating. Claire's mouth felt dry. She struggled to speak, but no words came out. Leonard filled in the silence. "Her husband is me." A sharp ringing filled Claire's ears. Captain Reeves sighed, rubbing his temple as if already exhausted by what was about to unfold. Leonard exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Mr. Ellis has personally requested that you correct this misunderstanding immediately," Captain Reeves said. Leonard's voice dropped, his tone sharper now. "And when this flight lands, Miss Matheson, you will be required to explain yourself directly to corporate." Claire's heart pounded against her ribs. "I understand." "Good," Leonard said simply. "Now go fix your mistake." Monica scrolled through her phone absent-mindedly, waiting. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Claire returning. The flight attendant's usual confidence was gone. Her face was pale, her movements stiff. She hesitated, as if gathering herself before approaching Monica's seat. Passengers who had ignored the earlier confrontation now paid attention. The shift in power was visible. Claire stopped beside Monica's seat and crouched slightly, lowering her voice but making sure those nearby could still hear. "Mrs. Ellis," she said carefully, "there seems to have been a misunderstanding. I'd like to personally offer you another pillow." Monica tilted her head slightly. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, voice calm but carrying weight. Claire's lips parted slightly before she nodded. "Yes." Monica blinked once, watching her. Then, her fingers moved over her phone screen again. "Monica. She's apologizing. What should I do?" A moment later, her phone vibrated. "Leonard. Take your time. Make her understand what she did." Monica placed her phone down and turned back to Claire. She wasn't in a rush. She let the silence stretch, forcing Claire to sit in her discomfort. Then, finally, she spoke. "You're saying it was a misunderstanding?" "Yes," Claire said, though her voice was weaker now. Monica exhaled slowly. "I had my ticket. I was in my assigned seat. I asked for something reasonable. And you refused publicly." Passengers shifted in their seats. Monica's eyes didn't waver. "You didn't ask anyone else in first class if they deserved to be here." She continued. "You didn't question if the man across from me was in his correct seat. You didn't check if the woman in 2C had a valid ticket. You just assumed I didn't belong." Claire swallowed hard. Monica leaned back, resting a hand on her belly. She didn't need to raise her voice. The silence itself was loud enough. And Claire Matheson had never felt so small. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted. The subtle, unspoken rules of polite avoidance, the kind that kept people from intervening when they saw something unjust, had been broken. Passengers who had ignored Monica Ellis before were now stealing glances. Their curiosity piqued, their expressions uneasy. Monica, however, was unbothered. She sat with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the battle had already been won. Claire Matheson, on the other hand, was unraveling. The flight attendant stood stiffly beside Monica's seat, her usually impeccable posture slightly faltering. She had spent years walking through these aisles with authority, expecting compliance. Now, the weight of her mistake pressed down on her like a storm cloud. And she had no idea how to navigate the shift in power. "I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding, Mrs. Ellis," Claire said, forcing a tight smile. Her voice was softer now, the bravado from before gone. "I would like to personally offer you another pillow." Monica tilted her head slightly, letting the moment stretch. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. Claire nodded stiffly. Monica exhaled slowly, adjusting her position in her seat, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. "I had my ticket. I was in my assigned seat. I asked for something reasonable. And you refused publicly. Claire's fingers twitched at her sides. She could feel the eyes on her now. Monica's voice remained even, yet there was something sharp beneath it. You didn't ask anyone else in first class if they deserved to be here. You didn't check if the man across from me had a valid ticket. You didn't question whether the woman in 2C belonged. But you looked at me and decided I was asking for too much. Claire swallowed hard, her throat tightening. I didn't mean. Monica didn't let her finish. But you did. Silence settled over the cabin like thick fog. Across the aisle, the businessman who had averted his gaze earlier, Mr. Calloway, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The older woman near the window folded her hands neatly in her lap, avoiding eye contact, but others watched with something close to quiet approval, as if they were relieved someone had finally said it out loud. Monica didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to demand anything. The truth, spoken plainly, was heavier than any outburst could ever be. Claire opened her mouth again, as if to argue, but she caught herself. There was no argument to be made. She had crossed the wrong person, and now she was standing in the wreckage of her own actions. Monica reached for her phone, her fingers moving over the screen. Monica. She's struggling to find the right words. What should I do? A few moments later, her phone vibrated with a response. Leonard. Make her sit in it. Monica's lips curled slightly. She placed the phone down and turned her gaze back to Claire. She wasn't going to offer her an easy escape. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she forced another polite smile. I assure you, Mrs. Ellis, I did not intend to make you feel uncomfortable. Monica studied her for a moment, then let out a quiet, amused hum. That's an interesting choice of words. Claire blinked. I just meant, you didn't intend for me to feel uncomfortable. Monica interrupted smoothly. Not that you didn't intend to dismiss me. A flicker of panic crossed Claire's face. Monica held her gaze. It's funny how people like you always apologize for how we feel. Never for what you did. Claire's mouth pressed into a thin line. Her heart pounded. She could feel the heat creeping up her neck. This wasn't just an apology anymore, this was an interrogation. And she was losing. I can assure you, Mrs. Ellis, that I meant no harm. She tried again, though her voice lacked conviction. Monica let the silence linger again, watching Claire squirm. Then, finally, she exhaled. Keep your pillow. Claire's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard. Monica leaned back, resting her head against the seat. I don't want it. The dismissal stung. Claire had expected Monica to take the pillow as a peace offering, to accept the apology and move on. But that wasn't what was happening. Instead, Monica had taken something from her. Her control, her authority. And now, Claire was left standing there, exposed, in front of a cabin full of people who had all seen her fail. For the first time in her career, Claire Matheson was not in control of the situation. Monica closed her eyes briefly, letting the moment settle. Then, as if Claire was no longer worth her time, she picked up her phone again and sent another message. Monica. I didn't take the pillow. What now? Leonard. Now we let her sweat. Claire lingered for a second too long, unsure of whether to say something else. Then, with a sharp nod, she turned on her heel and walked away, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Passengers watched her retreat down the aisle. For the first time since the flight had taken off, Monica felt a deep, quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. But she knew this wasn't over yet. Because when they landed, Claire Matheson wouldn't be the only one answering for what had happened. And Monica? She would be stepping off this plane not as someone who had been dismissed, but as someone who had won. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Los Angeles. Please fasten your seat belts and ensure your tray tables are in their upright positions. Monica Ellis took a deep breath, her fingers resting lightly over the curve of her belly. She felt the familiar pressure in her ears as the plane began its slow descent. But her focus wasn't on the landing. It was on the silent weight in the air, the kind of tension that had settled over first class since Claire Matheson had walked away humiliated. No one had spoken about what had happened, but everyone had felt it. Passengers who had avoided her gaze before now cast quick, uncertain glances in her direction, some with quiet approval, others with discomfort. as if unsure of where they stood in the invisible conflict that had played out at 35,000 feet. Monica wasn't interested in their newfound awareness. She was thinking about what would happen when they landed. She glanced at her phone one last time before the flight attendants made their final rounds. A new message from Leonard appeared on the screen. Leonard. Security is waiting at the gate. Stay seated when the doors open. A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corner of Monica's lips. She wasn't the type to make a scene. But Leonard? Leonard didn't believe in leaving loose ends. Claire Matheson stood near the beverage cart. Her hands clenched into fists. The usual efficiency in her movements was gone. She had barely spoken since returning from Monica's seat. And now, as the plane prepared to land, the walls felt like they were closing in on her. She needed this flight to end. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing against her. She could feel the stares. The whispers, whether real or imagined. She didn't know anymore. Lily, the younger flight attendant who had witnessed everything, stood nearby, stacking empty cups with deliberate slowness. Claire caught her staring and snapped. What? Lily hesitated, then shrugged. Nothing. Claire exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. This whole thing has been blown out of proportion. She muttered. It was just a pillow. Lily said nothing. Claire turned, eyes narrowing. You think I was wrong? Lily finally looked at her. I think, she said carefully, that you didn't think this would come back to you. Claire scoffed. She's just another entitled passenger who. But she stopped mid-sentence. Because the look on Lily's face, the quiet disappointment, the subtle shake of her head told Claire that whatever argument she was about to make was useless. And for the first time, Claire felt something close to fear. Because when this plane landed, she wouldn't be walking off the way she had always done. Monica adjusted her seatbelt, her body still aching from the long flight. But now, there was something else keeping her alert, something sharper, more electric. A few rows ahead, Mr. Calloway, the businessman who had watched everything unfold, cleared his throat awkwardly. He hesitated, glancing around before finally speaking. I just wanted to say that I saw what happened earlier. It wasn't right. Monica turned her head slightly, studying him. Mr. Calloway adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. I should have said something. When it happened, Monica tilted her head, her voice steady. Why didn't you? The older man swallowed. He had no good answer. No justification that didn't sound weak. He sighed. I don't know. Monica watched him squirm for a second, then offered a polite nod. Thank you for saying something now. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was acknowledgement. And as Mr. Calloway turned away, adjusting his newspaper as if to shield himself from his own discomfort, Monica understood something. People like him, people who saw but said nothing, were the reason people like Claire got away with it in the first place. The plane landed smoothly, the tires screeching against the runway. Passengers shifted in their seats, stretching their legs, reaching for their carry-ons. The usual post-flight shuffle began, the impatience, the urgency to be the first off the plane. But Monica stayed seated. She wasn't in a hurry. Claire, however, was. She hovered near the galley, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of the beverage cart, her breathing uneven. She just needed to get off the plane, get away from this flight, go home and pretend this never happened. But then, a uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane, and this time, everyone saw it. The officer moved with quiet authority, scanning the cabin before locking eyes on Claire. His voice was firm, professional. Miss Matheson, I need you to come with us. The entire first-class section froze. Claire's breath hitched. What? You need to come with us? Ma'am. Passengers exchanged glances. This was no longer just an awkward misunderstanding. This was something serious. Claire's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in years, she had no script, no way to maneuver out of this. Her feet felt heavy as she stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for her carry-on. And as she walked past Monica's seat, she didn't dare look at her. She knew she wouldn't like what she saw. The security officer led Claire off the plane. And just like that, she was gone. Monica let out a slow breath, then picked up her phone. Monica. She's off the plane. Seconds later, Leonard's response came. Leonard. Good. Monica smiled, finally unclipping her seatbelt. For the first time all flight, she felt comfortable. The heavy cabin doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. and the crisp Los Angeles air rushed in, replacing the pressurized stillness of the flight. The usual symphony of a plane's arrival filled the space, the rustling of overhead compartments, the hum of passengers stretching and adjusting their coats, the impatient shuffle of feet as people prepared to exit. But first class was different. There was no rush to leave. Not yet, because everyone had seen what had just happened. Monica Ellis remained seated, watching the empty space where Claire Matheson had just been escorted off the plane. There had been no yelling, no last-minute protests, just a quiet, undeniable removal, one that left behind a ripple of whispered conversations and exchanged glances. The man across the aisle, Mr. Calloway, had his eyes fixed on the folded newspaper in his lap, but he hadn't turned a page in minutes. He was pretending not to think about what had just happened. But Monica knew better. People like him were always good at pretending. She let out a slow, steady breath and reached for her phone. Monica. She's off the plane. Seconds later, a reply. Leonard. Good. Security has her statement. Corporate will handle the rest. Monica tapped her fingers against her phone, considering her next words. Monica. What happens now? She could almost see Leonard's smirk in his reply. Leonard. Now, we make sure she never does this to anyone again. Monica's lips curled slightly as she set her phone down. She wasn't someone who took pleasure in other people's downfall. She wasn't vindictive. But this wasn't about revenge. This was about accountability. Monica stayed seated as other passengers slowly stood, retrieving their bags from the overhead compartments. Some cast quick glances her way. Others deliberately avoided looking in her direction. Guilt, shame, curiosity. It was written across every face. She let them have their moment of reckoning. Let them sit with the weight of what they had witnessed but chosen not to stop. Then, finally, she stood. The shift was subtle, but she felt it immediately, the awareness of her presence, the silent acknowledgement of her victory. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat, still gripping his unread newspaper. I hope you enjoy your time in Los Angeles, Mrs. Ellis, he murmured, as if that simple well-wish could erase his earlier silence. Monica met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Thank you, she said, and nothing more. She didn't offer him absolution. He hadn't earned it. With steady steps, she moved toward the exit. The flight attendants, the remaining ones, stood at the doorway, their polite smiles in place. But this time, there was an added stiffness to their professionalism. Lily, the young flight attendant who had almost tried to help, stepped slightly forward. Mrs. Ellis, I just wanted to say. Monica raised a hand gently, stopping her. I know, she said simply. Lily swallowed, nodding in understanding. Then, Monica stepped onto the jet bridge, and the world outside was waiting. The moment Monica emerged into the terminal, she saw him. Leonard Ellis stood near the private security detail, his stance relaxed but commanding. He was a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. A man who made decisions that reshaped industries. Yet right now, his focus was entirely on her. She didn't need to say a word. His eyes scanned her face, reading the exhaustion, the quiet triumph, the flicker of residual frustration she still carried. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, reaching for her suitcase and taking it effortlessly from her grasp. Long flight? He asked, his voice low, warm. Monica let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Longer than it needed to be. Leonard's jaw tightened. She won't work for this airline again. Monica studied him. That's not enough. Leonard nodded as if he had expected her to say that. I know. Then, without another word, he took her hand and led her forward. His presence a quiet reassurance in the bustling terminal. Behind them, the world continued moving, passengers rushing to their gates, families reuniting, strangers passing by without a second glance. But Claire Matheson wasn't among them. And she never would be again. The black luxury sedan moved smoothly through the Los Angeles streets, the city lights flickering through the tinted windows. Monica leaned back against the leather seat, exhaling as she stretched her legs. The baby had settled after the flight, no longer shifting with restless kicks. Leonard sat beside her, his phone resting on his knee. But for once, he wasn't looking at it. What's next? She asked, watching the way the city blurred past outside. Leonard considered her question. She's already been placed on indefinite suspension. HR is reviewing the case. But I made it clear how this will end. Monica hummed, unimpressed. Suspension means they think there's room for a maybe. she said. And there isn't. Leonard's lips twitched in amusement. You're right. He picked up his phone and typed a quick message. A few moments later, it buzzed with a reply. He turned the screen so she could see. HR executive. Effective immediately. Claire Matheson is terminated. A formal statement will be released tomorrow. Monica nodded, satisfied. Leonard glanced at her. Better? Better, she admitted. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. The warmth of his palm. The steady grip. It was the first time in hours that she had felt truly at ease. Leonard squeezed her hand gently. You okay? Monica sighed, then smiled. I'm hungry. Leonard chuckled, already tapping the car's intercom. Take us home, he told the driver. Then, glancing at Monica, he added, and stop by that seafood place she likes. The driver acknowledged the request, and Monica grinned, closing her eyes for a moment. This day had started with humiliation, but it had ended with justice. And honestly, that was the kind of happy ending she could live with. The next morning, the Los Angeles sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the Ellis penthouse, casting soft golden light across the room. Monica Ellis stretched, feeling the stiffness in her body after the long flight. But this morning, unlike yesterday, she woke with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Claire Matheson was gone. It didn't erase what had happened, but it ensured that it wouldn't happen again to her, or to someone else who had the misfortune of sitting in the wrong seat with the wrong face at the wrong time. She turned over to find Leonard already awake, seated at the edge of the bed, his phone in hand. He was scrolling through emails, his sharp eyes scanning each message with the same meticulous focus he used in boardrooms and business negotiations. Monica propped herself up on one elbow. It's early for emails, she murmured, her voice still laced with sleep. Leonard glanced over, setting his phone down on the nightstand. It's not just emails, he said, stretching one arm across the back of the headboard. The airline issued a formal statement this morning. That got Monica's attention. She sat up fully, pulling the sheets around her as Leonard reached for his phone again and turned the screen toward her. The official statement from the airline's PR team was displayed in crisp, professional lettering. Statement from SkyWest Airlines. SkyWest Airlines is committed to ensuring all passengers receive the highest standard of service, regardless of race, gender, or background. Following an internal investigation, we have terminated an employee whose actions did not reflect the values of our company. We deeply regret the experience of Mrs. Monica Ellis and will implement new measures, including mandatory training, to reinforce our commitment to fairness and dignity in all customer interactions. Monica read the statement twice. She wasn't surprised, but she wasn't entirely satisfied either. They're protecting themselves, she noted, handing the phone back. Leonard smirked. Of course they are. This isn't about accountability, it's about optics. She exhaled, leaning back against the pillows. They don't regret what happened. They regret that it happened to me. Leonard's expression darkened slightly. That's why it's not enough, he said, sliding his phone onto the nightstand. They're hoping this statement will make the issue disappear. Monica turned to him, studying the way his fingers tapped idly against the bedsheet. You already have a plan, don't you? Leonard let out a low chuckle. You know me too well. She raised a brow. What are you going to do? Leonard leaned back on one elbow, his voice calm but firm. I'm making sure this doesn't just end with a PR statement. I already spoke with the board this morning. We're revising training protocols for every flight attendant, not just first-class crew. And we're setting up a direct passenger feedback line, so complaints like yours don't have to go viral before they're addressed. Monica tilted her head, impressed. And what happens if someone else like Claire slips through? Leonard's jaw tightened. Then we make sure they know if you can't treat every passenger with respect. You don't deserve to wear our uniform. Monica studied him for a moment, then smiled. You really don't like loose ends. Leonard smirked. I don't. She leaned in, pressing a kiss to his cheek. Good, neither do I. After breakfast, Monica sat on the balcony, a cup of tea warming her hands as she let the gentle breeze push away the last remnants of yesterday's frustration. Her phone buzzed beside her. She glanced at the screen and froze. Unknown number. Mrs. Ellis. I know I don't have the right to ask for your time, but if possible, I'd like to speak with you. Please let me know if you're willing to meet. Claire Matheson. Monica's stomach twisted, not with anger, but with something else. She tapped the message, staring at the blinking cursor as she debated her response. A week ago, she might have deleted it. A day ago, she might have ignored it. But now, she wasn't sure what she wanted. The cafe was quiet, tucked into a quiet street in downtown LA, far from the corporate bustle. Monica arrived 5 minutes early. She didn't know why she had agreed to meet Claire, but she trusted her instincts. And her instincts told her that whatever this was, it wasn't about apologies. She spotted Claire at a small table near the window. She looked different. Not in the physical sense, her blonde hair was still perfectly in place. Her outfit still neat, but something in her posture had changed. She no longer carried herself with the forced confidence of a woman who thought she owned the space she occupied. She looked smaller. Monica approached slowly. Claire noticed her and immediately stood, hesitating before offering an uncertain nod. "Mrs. Ellis," she started, her voice quieter than Monica had ever heard it. Monica gestured to the chair. "Sit." They both did. A beat of silence passed. Claire's fingers twitched around the coffee cup in front of her. "I wanted to thank you for meeting me," she began. Monica waited. Claire inhaled deeply. "I had deserved what happened," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I won't pretend that I didn't." Monica tilted her head slightly. "Then why am I here?" Claire swallowed. "Because I need to understand." Monica blinked. That was the last thing she expected her to say. Claire continued, eyes fixed on the table. "When I was escorted off that plane, I felt humiliated. I felt small. And for the first time, I think I understood what it's like to be seen as less than." Monica didn't speak. Claire clenched her jaw. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I wouldn't, if I were you. But I need to know, how many times has this happened to you?" Monica sighed, setting her tea down. "Claire, this wasn't about just you. People like you, people in power, whether they realize it or not, make choices every day. Some big, some small. And those choices tell people like me whether we belong or not." Claire exhaled shakily. I think I finally see it." Monica nodded slowly. "Seeing it isn't enough. What are you going to do about it?" Claire looked up. And for the first time, Monica saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Understanding. Accountability. And maybe, just maybe, a chance for change. The air in Los Angeles carried a certain weight that morning. Thick with the quiet hum of the city waking up, Monica Ellis sat at the large glass dining table in their penthouse, a cup of tea in her hands. The view stretched wide before her, endless city lights dimming as dawn took over. The skyline slowly shifting from night to day. But Monica's thoughts weren't on the view. Her phone sat beside her. Claire Matheson's message still lingering on the screen. She had met Claire. She had listened. And yet, even now, she wasn't sure what she felt. A part of her wanted to move on. To tuck this entire experience into the past like a book she had finished reading. But another part of her, the part that had spent years navigating spaces like first class boardrooms, high-end boutiques, all while being subtly questioned, subtly dismissed, knew that what had happened wasn't just about her. It never was. She took a sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest, grounding her. Then, she heard the familiar sound of Leonard's voice. Leonard Ellis had spent most of his life understanding power. How to wield it, how to control it, how to make it work for those who didn't have it. And this morning, he was doing exactly that. Standing at the head of the SkyWest executive conference room, he looked across the table at the board members, men and women who had run this company for years, who knew their industry inside and out. But today, their usual confidence had a crack in it. Because Leonard had called this meeting. And Leonard never called meetings unless something was about to change. He set his hands on the smooth mahogany table and spoke with the same quiet authority that had built his empire. "I don't like being here," he began. "I don't like having to stand in front of you and explain why one of your employees thought they had the right to humiliate my wife in first class. I don't like that it took me getting involved for you to act." Silence. No one dared to speak. Leonard let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "Let's be clear," he said, his tone measured but firm. "This isn't just about Claire Matheson. If it were, I wouldn't be here. This is about the culture you've allowed to grow within your airline. The culture that says some passengers deserve more respect than others." A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "I've already ensured that Claire Matheson is no longer employed by this company," he continued. "But that's not enough. If she felt comfortable treating my wife like that, It means there are dozens more like her. People who have never been held accountable because they knew they'd never have to be. His gaze swept across the table, pinning each executive in place. That ends today. One of the executives, a man named Richard Hale, cleared his throat. Mr. Ellis, we've already issued a formal apology and a revised training protocol. We're committed to making sure something like this doesn't happen again. Leonard gave a small, humorless chuckle. An apology? He leaned forward slightly. You think an apology is enough? Richard hesitated. Leonard cut him off. Let me make this very simple for you. SkyWest Airlines will be implementing mandatory bias and customer service training for every employee, not just flight attendants, but ground staff, gate agents, executives, everyone who interacts with passengers. And this won't be some corporate video you watch once and forget. It will be ongoing, real, and measurable. A woman at the far end of the table, Michelle Tran, leaned forward. And if we refuse? Leonard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then I pull my investments from this airline. And I make sure every shareholder knows why. The silence that followed was thick. Because Leonard Ellis wasn't just any investor. He was the investor. And they all knew it. By the time Leonard returned home that afternoon, Monica had already guessed what had happened. She could tell by the way he loosened his tie. By the way he exhaled slightly before sitting across from her at the dining table. How bad was it? She asked. Her voice smooth, curious. Leonard smirked. Bad for them, good for everyone else. She nodded, taking another sip of her tea. So they're actually going through with it? They don't have a choice. He leaned back, stretching slightly. Training will be mandatory. Reports will be tracked. Passenger complaints will be addressed before someone has to call corporate headquarters. And Claire? He exhaled. She'll never work in this industry again. Monica listened, letting the information settle. It was the outcome she had expected. The outcome she had wanted. But there was still something lingering in the back of her mind. She tapped her fingers against her cup. Then finally asked, what if she actually changes? Leonard looked at her. Claire? Monica nodded. She asked me how many times this had happened to me before. Leonard frowned slightly, leaning forward. And what did you say? Monica sighed. I told her the truth. That this wasn't just about her. That people like her make choices every day whether they realize it or not that tell people like me where we stand. Leonard was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, and do you think she understood? Monica hesitated, then shook her head. Not yet, but I think she's starting to. Leonard studied her for a moment, then reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Do you regret meeting with her? She exhaled. No. Do you forgive her? Monica was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, she said, I don't know. The evening sky stretched wide over Los Angeles. A deep shade of blue that had yet to surrender to the full darkness of night. From the balcony of their penthouse, Monica Ellis could see the city breathing below, headlights weaving through the streets. Distant laughter rising from the cafes. The hum of life moving forward. She exhaled slowly, the events of the past few days settling in her bones like the final notes of a long, complicated symphony. Leonard sat beside her, his tie loosened, a glass of whiskey resting between his fingers. He hadn't said much since dinner. But then again, he rarely needed to. He was a man who spoke in actions. And today, his actions had reshaped an entire airline. The weight of it all pressed against Monica's chest. Not in a suffocating way, but in the way that reminded her that change, real change, was never simple. You're quiet, Leonard finally said, watching her carefully. Monica let out a soft chuckle. You always say that when you know I'm thinking about something. I always know when you're thinking about something. He smirked, taking a slow sip of his drink. Question is, do you want to talk about it? She hesitated, then placed her teacup down on the small table beside her. I've spent my whole life in places where people like Claire got to decide who belonged. And for the first time, I made someone like her see it. Leonard nodded, but remained quiet, letting her continue. Monica turned to him, her expression unreadable. But what happens now? That was the real question, wasn't it? Claire Matheson was gone. SkyWest Airlines was making changes. Leonard had forced an entire industry to take a second look at itself. But was that enough? Monica had spent so long learning how to navigate a world that didn't always welcome her. She knew how to smile past discomfort, how to carry herself with a dignity that refused to bend under scrutiny. But this wasn't just about her. It never had been. She picked up her phone, scrolling through the unread messages that had flooded in after the airline's public statement. Some were from reporters asking for an interview. Others were from women, Black women, Latina women, Middle Eastern women who had their own versions of the flight that shouldn't have happened. One message caught her eye. Unknown number. Mrs. Ellis, I don't expect a response. But I wanted to say that your story made me think. I work as a flight attendant. And I see things like this more often than I should. I wish I had spoken up when it happened. I will next time. Monica inhaled sharply. Leonard, sensing the shift in her posture, leaned closer. What is it? She handed him the phone, letting him read the message himself. When he was done, he placed it back on the table, nodding slightly. It's working, he murmured. Monica swallowed, something warm curling in her chest. Maybe, she said, but what if we can do more? Leonard raised a brow. I'm listening. The next morning, Monica sat in front of the large mahogany desk in Leonard's home office, her fingers resting on the keyboard of her laptop. The cursor blinked at her. Waiting. She had already made up her mind. This wasn't going to be just another story that people read, shake their heads at, and then forget. This was going to be something else. Leonard walked in, sipping his morning coffee. So, he said, leaning against the doorway, what's this look on your face? Monica smirked, the look of a woman who's about to cause some good trouble. He chuckled, stepping closer. What are you thinking? She turned the screen toward him. New initiative proposal. Passenger Advocacy Program. A new initiative designed to collect real-time reports of discrimination in first-class and business-class travel. Reports will be reviewed by a diverse oversight board, ensuring airlines follow through with accountability measures. Leonard read the words carefully, his expression thoughtful. Then, he glanced at her. This is big. It needs to be. He leaned against the desk, setting his coffee down. You know this means we'll have to go public. Interviews, speaking engagements, possibly lawsuits. Are you ready for that? Monica considered his words. Then, she smiled. I've been ready my whole life. 2 weeks later, Monica stood at the podium of a sleek conference room. Cameras flashing, journalists scribbling notes. The SkyWest scandal had caught national attention, and she had agreed to speak on her terms. She took a deep breath and faced the room. I didn't expect this to happen. She began. I didn't expect to board a flight, ask for a pillow, and be dismissed as if I wasn't supposed to be there. But I also didn't expect so many of you, so many women, so many people of color to reach out and say, me too. This has happened to me too. She let the weight of those words settle. This is bigger than me. This is about what happens when power goes unchecked. When people in authority, whether it's a flight attendant, a manager, or a CEO, believe that some people deserve dignity while others do not. A murmur spread through the crowd. Leonard sat in the front row, watching her with quiet pride. Monica lifted her chin slightly. But this isn't just about calling out what's wrong. It's about building something better. That's why I'm launching a new passenger advocacy program, designed to ensure that complaints of discrimination don't just disappear into corporate black holes. It's time for accountability. It's time for change. A reporter raised his hand. Mrs. Ellis, do you believe Claire Matheson deserved to be fired? The room went still. Monica considered her answer carefully. Then, she said, I believe that Claire Matheson made a choice. She saw me and decided I was less. And for the first time in her life, she faced real consequences for that choice. Another pause. Then, a woman in the back clapped. A second later, more people joined in. And then, the whole room. Monica stood tall, letting the applause wash over her, not for revenge, but for justice, for change, for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. 6 months later, Monica boarded another flight first class. As always, but this time, something was different. A young black woman sat beside her, adjusting her seatbelt, looking slightly nervous. Monica smiled at her. First time flying first class? The woman nodded. Yeah, I almost didn't do it. I kept wondering if I'd feel out of place. Monica's smile widened. You do belong here, and if anyone makes you feel otherwise. She handed her a card with the Passenger Advocacy Program's logo on it. Call me. The woman took the card, her eyes widening in recognition. Wait, you're her. Monica Ellis. Monica chuckled. I am. The flight took off, smooth and steady. And for the first time in a long time, Monica Ellis felt something she hadn't felt before. Freedom.